Hello, I'm Natasha Duarte. I'm here with my co-author, Dr. Kristen Allett, and this is the additional video on physiology and understanding the physiological causes of anxiety that we talk about in Chapter 3. Part of why we're making this supplemental video is because a lot of the concepts in this chapter can be hard for some people to understand, and we've just found through our trainings that it's really helpful to be able to read it and to hear it and to see it presented in different ways. So while we will be following the same concepts that we shared in Chapter 3 of our workbook, we are going to be presenting some of the material in different ways to just help you have an idea of what the physiology is about.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Natasha. As she said, hopefully this will just help you understand your brain and your body a little better. I think the concepts in Fuel Your Brain, Not Your Anxiety are familiar with many people, but the why around it is really, I think, so important for people actually utilizing the information. First disclaimer, this book and this video is for educational purposes only and is not intended to replace your healthcare professional. And so if you have any questions, you should ask your healthcare professional. In this video, we're going to talk about the reactive brain versus the responsive brain and give you some examples of why it's important to know which one you might be in. Understand what influences your brain and your mood. And then we're going to just touch in on some actionable tools. So part of what the book is talking about and really trying to get people to be aware of is the impact of hypoglycemia on their brain and their body. And there's two types of hypoglycemia. There is the medical definition of hypoglycemia, which is your blood glucose. The glucose is the main fuel for your brain, and it can be measured in your blood. And when it's below 65 milligrams per deciliter, that's technically medical hypoglycemia. Most people don't get that low. It's really uncomfortable to get that low. But what I see happen all the time is as our blood glucose starts to drop, the hormones that come forward to stop that process and raise it up again have impact on our brain and body, and we're going to talk about that. But first, I'm going to do a few studies that I didn't do in the book. And one of the studies is that hypoglycemia leads to decreased attention span, emotional regulation, inability to cope with stress, as well as criminality, aggression, impulsive behaviors, and addictions. And part of this is because when we get hypoglycemic, we're in our reactive brain versus our responsive brain, our responsive cortex brain. For the word cloud here, rather than doing study after study, we just put it together in a word cloud, the number of things that are impacted by food insecurity, glucose control. And really what it comes down to is not knowing or the lack of attention to how food affects mood. And as you can see, it has personal effects as well as societal effects. Many of those are references at the end of the book, and they're also pretty easy to find on PubMed. But a couple of studies. So Felice Jacka is one of my favorite researchers, and you can look her up in PubMed. But she did this amazing prospective study with 3,000 adolescents. And what she found is the higher the quality of their diet, the better their mental health. And the lower their quality diet, the worse their mental health. And some of the adolescents actually had their quality of diet significantly changed over the course of the study. Their mental health trended with their food. And so if their food choices got better or access got better, their mental health improved. If it got worse, their mental health became more challenging. And this applies to adults as well. It's just we don't get the funding for 3,000 adults very easily. So another study that I want to share is a study about judges, because a lot of studies, people are like, well, that's with people with mental health, or that's with college students, or that's with, there's some reason why it's not the right population and that people in the right mind will do better. So they did a study with judges who were reviewing files for parole. And so they would read it and then they would consider, should this people be considered for parole or should they stay in jail for another year? the judges knew that they were in a study. They thought they might be in an implicit bias study, looking at how they might view different race or gender. And so they were aware of that. And so you would think they would be trying extra hard. And so, but really they were just looking at, did they make different decisions based on when they last ate? So these highly educated, mostly men, what they found was that immediately after a meal, 65% of the people were considered for parole, which is great. They're looking at all the factors and really being thoughtful about that decision. Immediately before a meal, so like right before lunch, I just want you to stop and guess. I'm going to give you a moment to think, how many people do you think were considered for parole the hour before a meal? When I do this publicly, what I hear people say, 40%, 20%. Ready? 0. That is not justice. That is the difference between the smart cortex brain making a decision and the reactive limbic brain making a decision. The reactive limbic brain makes decisions based on survival and the most conservative position, and isn't part of that compassionate, curious sense of our mind. It is the most reactive part of our brain and is not necessarily fair. So Natasha and I use this concept of 4 quadrants of self to think about how people are in their day. And so I'm just going to take a few minutes to explain these 4 quadrants. So first, there's our physical body, right? The physical body is, I think of it as our power supply. And our power supply, which gives us the energy for our brain, our mind, and our relationships. And so our brain is like hardware. Things get wired in there, habits, routines, language, all sorts of things get wired in there, which is great. We need that. But for our brain to function well, not have anxiety or depression, we need a power supply. And for us to not have fatigue, we need a power supply. Our relationships can impact our power supply. So when we are in really challenging relationships, it's really hard to not have a lot of energy. And when we're in really supportive relationships, we do better. And those 3 concepts, the brain, the body, and the relationships, they form the mind. I like Dan Siegel's definition of that is an emergent property that arises out of the brain, body, and relationships. And so what is an emergent property? Clouds are emergent property. I live in the Northwest. Everybody in the Northwest are firm cloud believers because when there are clouds, there are rain. We can see the consequences of the existence, right? But you can't go up into a plane and capture a cloud and bring it down into a room because it emerges under certain conditions. And it's the same for our mind. And our mind is the quality that allows us to be in the present moment, to be curious, to be compassionate, to be self-compassionate and self-aware. So Natasha, how do you understand and use this?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think about when I think of what is my mind, what makes that up is a good example is when I'm sick. If I'm really sick, I can sort of keep functioning. I'm there, I'm, feeding myself, I'm getting water, I'm taking care of the bare minimums, but I'm not able to formulate, really complex thoughts. I'm not able to engage in conversations. And it's definitely not a time where I would want to be making big decisions or decisions about what I'm going to do or things that might impact, have an impact further than just while I'm sick. So that's sort of what I think about it. And then when I'm feeling better again, I can definitely tell I can start thinking about connecting those dots and putting stuff together so I can get more of my life attended to and my relationships attended to.
Yeah. And the same is also true when we get challenged by anxiety, right? So the other day I had an event happen and it was a triggering event for me. And I got super still and I'm like, okay, this is making me anxious. And all the things that I wanted to do were not appropriate for the moment because my brain was like, last time this happened, the best thing that we could do is this. And it took me some time to sit there and get back into my mind and say, okay, what is the best thing for me to do? What is the safest thing for me to do? What is the most compassionate thing that I can do for this situation? And I could do that only because I had eaten right before this event. And if I had not eaten, I would have probably just jumped up and said, the world's on fire and I gotta leave, which would not have been appropriate. But that concept did cross my brain. That's what my brain was like, you should do that. So we're gonna talk a little more about that. The first thing that we always want to check in with people is like, what is your power supply? Because as your power supply is lower in general, it's harder to change, it's harder to get things done, it's harder, life is just harder. And so one of the things that I tell people is that if your power supply during the day is below a 7 in general, you have to figure out why that is. And our book goes over the things that increase your power supply. So generally it's something that you're eating, not getting enough sleep or good enough sleep, or not moving your body, or that you have a nutritional deficiency that needs to be identified. But a lot of people will get just the essentials done. They will be at a 5 all day. Now, if you're at a 5 and it's 9 o'clock at night, that makes sense. But making sure you have a good or great power supply throughout the day is really important. So let's talk about the different parts of your brain, because we've been talking about the responsive cortex and the reactive limbic brain. And so the cerebral cortex, which is this part of our brain, helps us with self-awareness and connection to others and problem solving and memory and learning and organizing, like those things that help us be who we like to be, right? The hippocampus is sort of the mediator between our two brains, and it's called executive functioning, and it helps us focus our attention, our emotions, our planning, and behavior. So when I was in this event that I really got anxious, I had to really focus my attention on, am I going to be in my smart brain or am I going to be in my reactive brain? How I do that, and some of you who have worked with therapists have done the exercise of where you become more aware of your senses, because what we see, smell, taste, touch, and feel, all of those senses, when there's no adrenaline in the system, go into our cerebral cortex and our hippocampus, so that we can just make smart, compassionate, curious, good decisions. However, if we go too long without food, or something triggers us, something external from us triggers us, scares us, startles us, what happens is adrenaline comes in the system, and the adrenaline cuts off all of our sensory input that's going into the smart part of our brain, and now is going into our limbic system. And our limbic system is there to keep us alive, not to make sure that we live well, but just simply keep us alive. And so it's going to take in whatever's happening and decide, should I run from it? Should I aggress to it? Should I get angry and hit it, fight with it? Should I disappear? So humans can freeze, but mostly I see them disappear. What disappear looks like is where we limit our emotional context, what will emotionally come in. And this can be my favorite, Ben & Jerry's ice cream, or alcohol, drugs, Facebook, where we're like, la, 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 nothing can get here, right? Sugar, lots and lots of sugar. And while we're there, our reactive past behaviors are going to be more accessible. And so we're going to reach for what has been useful in the past, which may or may not be useful in the present. So in the particular situation that I am, get up and run away was a technique that I used in my 20s. If I didn't like what was going on, I would just leave and usually go cry in the bathroom. And so I developed more skills over time, but that wiring is still there, right? And that's my first go-to if I'm not careful. So how do we slip into this with our food? So let's take a scenario where somebody gets up and has breakfast, and it's like cereal or toast or muffin. All of those things are carbohydrates, and they're going to quickly be broken down into glucose when they enter your bloodstream. And so your blood glucose is going to go up, and then it's going to come back down. And insulin is this really cool hormone. It's our only storage hormone. Because like historically, like it was weird to have more food that we could store. And so why make it complicated? So the body just has one storage hormone. And so insulin's job is to get glucose out of the bloodstream and into all the cells in our body. And so as we eat things that have carbohydrates in it that are sweet, such as breads, pastas, candies, ice cream, all those things, our blood glucose is going to go up. It's going to come back down because insulin's putting it away in our cells. Our brain, our cortex brain, is going to have fuel, a good fuel supply for 1.5, maybe 2 hours. But after that amount of time, what's going to happen is a whole host of hormones are going to be released. And I'm not going to go through all the hormones. You can look that up on the internet. We just want to focus on one of them, which is adrenaline. And the reason why we focus on adrenaline that's in this hormonal cocktail is because it impacts both the brain and the body. And so if we go too long, we have this adrenaline hit, which is almost like a bear being in a room. Now, if a bear walked in the room right now with me, I would know why I'm anxious. And I would just go out the door and out the balcony and we would be done with it, right? And I would go home and I would be like, there was a bear in my room. And I would know why I'm anxious. But when we have a donut for breakfast at 8 o'clock and at 10 o'clock, we start to feel anxious, like our heart starts to race, our mind starts to race, our hands might get cold or sweaty. We might be trembling a little. We might also feel really fatigued. We might be a little nauseous. All of those things can happen. And it's because the donut has been utilized quickly and put into cells, and our smart brain doesn't have enough glucose, and it's our limbic system starting to take over. And it's going to filter everything that we see from the perspective of fight or flight or disappear. And so like somebody could say something to you and you'd be like, oh, they were so mean to me. And they're just like, I was just giving you feedback, right? And we will overreact. So what I did in medical school, and is very common to avoid that, is to just eat sugar every 2 hours. Just do. And then because of the weight loss industry, which feeds us a whole bunch of shame and not really adequate information, we feel guilty because we're eating sugar all the time and we don't have willpower. I didn't share the slide, but there are studies that show that willpower has everything to do with when you last ate. And so if you're going long at time without eating, like you don't have a lot of willpower. The other thing that's why we eat sugar when we've had a really bad day is sugar or alcohol, is that 20 minutes after eating something that's sugary, like my Ben & Jerry's ice cream or having a glass of wine or beer, is we're going to get a signal in our brain that everything's okay. Serotonin's going to get to our brain. And I use that concept. So when I have a really bad day, instead of eating the entire pint of Ben & Jerry's ice cream, which I can do in 20 minutes, I just scoop myself 2 scoops of ice cream and set it and say to myself, you can have the rest of the Ben & Jerry's ice cream, but you have to wait 20 minutes first. And generally by then, my neurology is a little more stable. I got the signal that everything's okay, and I'm busy doing other things. Here's the physiology. So let's talk about what's happening here, just in step-by-step form. So we have declining fuel to the brain. We don't eat any food because we don't have access, or we feel like we just ate 2 hours ago. Why would we eat again? The fuel to our brain continues to decline. And so there's a signal from our brain to release adrenaline. And our liver is stimulated to convert protein into glucose. And ultimately that comes from our muscle mass. And the whole purpose of that is to fuel the brain. Now, the alternative to that, because that whole line's a little problematic, is that we can notice that we have declining fuel, or we just know that we need to eat again. We can eat protein with carbs, and then we will have glucose from the carbs and protein, which will stabilize our glucose as well. And then our brain is fueled for a longer period of time, and we miss the adrenaline, right? So this is how we explained it in the book. How I explain it when I do public speaking. Again, we're in a situation where we had a piece of toast for breakfast at 8 o'clock. It's 10 o'clock. We have declining fuel to the brain. The brain's like, we need food. And so this cocktail comes out, adrenaline comes out. The liver is stimulated to make glucose for the brain. Glucose also goes into fat tissue. That's just how it is. The fat tissue is just one of those things. It's like, come on in, have a seat. You'll never have to leave. And so that's fat tissue. So our liver makes glucose out of protein. It cannot make glucose out of fat, which is sad for us, but that's the reality. And the protein is either going to come from our diet, or it's going to come from ultimately from our muscle mass. Muscle mass is what sets our metabolic rate, which determines one of the determinants of how many calories we get to eat. And so when we go long periods of time without eating, essentially we're eating ourselves and we're lowering our muscle mass. And which is, just as a side comment, why I hate quick weight loss programs, because most quick weight loss programs, people lose a lot of muscle mass, and which is why they gain weight back very quickly, because their metabolism is functionally lower. Muscle mass is one of the major determinants of not only physical health, but good mental health. And here's why. When you use your muscles, if you stand up and do 4 chair squats right now, one, you will get brain-derived neurotropic factor, which will help you learn this material better. So simple. So brain-derived neurotropic factor is a peptide, a neuropeptide, that is made when we use our muscles. And so in order for us to live in a world that's changing all the time, which can make us inherently anxious, having a lot of muscle mass, which means eating good sources of protein, getting lots of sleep, and moving our body is really important. The other thing that muscle mass does is that it increases our insulin receptivity, which basically makes it harder for us to get diabetes and diabetes type diseases like polycystic ovary disease, obesity, cardiovascular disease, dementia. All of those things, we need lots of muscle mass to prevent that. And so we want to make sure there's enough protein in our diet distributed throughout the course of the day so that we're not eating our muscle mass and we can keep it on, which, by the way, muscle mass is ultimately what burns our fat mass. Hopefully this is sort of pulling that chapter a little more together for you. So let's just review the summary of physiology. Just for those people who are like, wow, that was more science than what I've had since high school. So we're just gonna summarize this in a tight slide. So first, the brain will use the body for fuel if it's not fed by food. Using the body for food requires adrenaline. Using the body as food frequently over years causes a decrease in brain-derived neurotropic factor, decrease in muscle mass, decrease in metabolic rate, and increase in obesity. The brain, when being fed from the body, has exposure to adrenaline, which shifts us from our cerebral cortex, our smart brain, into our reactive limbic brain. When we are in our reactive limbic brain, our willpower is low, we are responding through the filter of fight or flight, disappear, and our reactive past behaviors. So it's not a pleasant place to be. And I kind of consider the limbic brain sort of like the basement that you just keep throwing junk down, and you don't want to go into it because it's dark and it's creepy, and all the things we don't want to think about is down there. And like having the decisions made from that basement is a bad idea. So the physiological solutions, the crux of our workbook is that if you eat protein with meals, you will double your power supply to your brain. So just make sure that there's protein in all your meals and your snacks. The anxiety will come down and the fatigue will come down. That's the basics of that. And protein is just a slower burning fuel than carbohydrates. It's nice to have a little fat in there. It's nice to have some fiber in there. And so the basic formula that we go into is you want to have carbs, protein, fat, and fiber. But that's the next couple of chapters. Really, we're just talking about the core physiology today. What we see when people are getting enough protein is that they have decreased anxiety, less fatigue, particularly in the afternoons, more energy, better and more stable moods, less depression, better sleep, and less early morning waking. So one of the concepts we are going to talk about in the book is early morning waking, or 3 a.m. committee meetings. This is the when you wake up and your committee is like, oh, I should have said, and he should have said, and by the way, blah, blah, blah. And then I always have one committee member is like, we need to go back to sleep. And it usually lasts about 2 hours. And when you get up and you have a lizard brain treat, which we'll talk about in a moment, most people will go back to sleep within the half hour. Higher metabolism due to increased muscle mass and hungry less often. Oh, I'm going to go back up. Less fatigue, particularly in the afternoons. If you're somebody who tends to be really tired 8 to 10 hours after waking, generally that's because you didn't get up and eat breakfast with protein within an hour of waking. It's really important to get up and have breakfast, because otherwise you're just burning all the resources that you stored up while you were sleeping super fast. Rather than a slow burn, it's a fast burn. And so by the end of the afternoon, you're just like, I can't function. So again, this works as well with anger, but we focused on anxiety in the workbook. And, is it emotional or is it hypoglycemia? And starting to separate those out is helpful, and being fed will help you separate those out, or at least asking yourself, when was the last time I ate? Oh, I feel like I might have a panic attack. Generally speaking, I don't see a lot of panic attacks happen unless they're 5 hours from food. Sometimes people will have gotten some candy in those 5 hours, but like real food, it's much harder to have a panic attack if you just ate. Some of the food concepts that we go into is lizard brain treat. It's a little top box of juice and a handful of nuts. Throughout the book, we talk about different uses of this. When somebody's having high anxiety or a panic attack, it's great to have that in your bag or hand it to them. I have patients come into my office and they're like, and I'm just like, juice, nuts? And now that we're in the COVID moment, I'm like, go to your kitchen and get something sweet and some protein. Like, I don't care, a spoonful of honey, like, go get some fuel. And when they're in my office, you can just see they're like, oh, and then like as their brain gets some fuel, they just like click in, and I'm like, so what's happening? And they're like, oh my God, let me tell you. But talking to a lizard, or if you have a teenager come home and they're like, ah, you're like, don't talk to a lizard, like just hand them some juice and nuts and back away slowly. So that's a place that we use lizard brain treats. Lizard brain treats are also useful through early morning wakings, just putting them by your bedstand. Or if people wake anxious, like some people just wake into anxiety, and that's because the brain has run out of fuel and there's just a lot of adrenaline in the system. And so having juice and nuts right by your bed is really useful. Sometimes it helps with PTSD nightmares and just having it by your bedstand. So those are different places that we talk about lizard brain treats. And then we also talk about lizard brain meals, and we go into a lot of detail in the 4th and 5th, 6th chapter. But the basic concept is, if you know that first try and have protein with all your meals and ideally your snacks. And then second, if you're going into the situation where you know that you need to be at your best, like a job interview or taking a test in school or a court date, or where you're like, this moment really counts, when we have adrenaline in our system, we're not very hungry, because all the blood's going from our digestive system into our muscles, because our body assumes we're going to have a physical fight, right? Like we're either going to wrestle a buffalo down, because that's what happened, 1,000 years ago. But now we have intellectual, and so we really have to be in our smart brain. And so if you're not hungry, you could also have a protein shake. But like if you get protein in before an event that you have to be at your best, you will be using your smart cortex brain rather than your lizard brain to get through it. And it will go better. So that's the other concept we work up in the book. This is why we focus so heavily on the power supply, and making sure that through food, what you eat and when you eat, and sleep and movement that supports who you are and where you're at and your body, is so important, because that helps to optimize our brain so we can be better about decision making and creativity and health. We can better engage in our relationships, and we have a better relationship with ourselves, because self-compassion is one of the hardest things to work on, but we can't do that when we're living in our basement with all the stuff that's happened in our past. We start the book talking about Chan Hellman's work, because I think it's hugely significant work for everybody around hope. He wrote the foreword to our book. We all need hope, and how he breaks down hope is its willpower and way power. To enjoy life, we usually need to have an identified goal that we want to move towards. And the best way to do that, like how I like to get to my goals, is just jump and be there. But like, so far that's never happened in my life. Like I usually have to do the slow process of taking small little steps towards that goal, like writing a book. Took many, 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 many steps. And thanks to Natasha's great organizational skills, we made it. And but we created a structure so that we could take small little steps to do that and move forward. And this is the way power, in terms of like identifying what steps will move you towards your goal. But inevitably, as you move towards your goal, obstacles are going to arise. And sure enough, like we had obstacles arise in our lives that we had to figure out how to overcome to manifest the goal of writing a book or anything else in our lives. And in order to think about what we're going to do when we run into an obstacle, are we going to go under it? Are we going to go over it? Are we going to go around it? Are we going to get somebody else to help us to get through it? Like, how are we going to do that? We need to take care of our power supply. And our power supply is our willpower. And when we do not have sufficient fuel, we are in our limbic brain, and it's much harder for us to move forward. And the likelihood is we will wrap back around and go back to where we were safe and not continue towards our goal. Like, oh, the book will never be done. The book, like no one will believe in the book. No, like all those stories, they were all part of our story. But by taking small little steps and keeping ourselves fueled, we had more willpower, so we could stay in the prefrontal cortex and be like, oh yeah, like there was that, or I didn't get that done, or I'll do this now, or all those little things that happen in the process of writing a book. And so what was nice is we worked hard to stay well fueled, and we would be like, I need to take a break and go get fuel because I'm melting down at this moment, right? Which then allowed the goal that we value. And the purpose for us writing this book is not that people eat small little meals with protein in it. Like, that would be nice. I think people would be a lot more comfortable. But what I really want is that each and every one of you who reads the book and listens to this video, like, can be like, oh, because I have this information, I can now get that thing that I've always wanted to get done. Because I now have the brain and the physical energy to move it forward. Thank you so much for your interest and your curiosity, and we really hope the book is useful to you. Please reach out and find us. Both of us love giving people resources and helping people out. And so you can find us at KristenAllett.com and Protein for All.
Thanks, everybody.